The university has been responding to the crisis, and we are proud of the work that our students, our staff, and our alumni are undertaking to support both the local community in Manchester and the global fight against the pandemic. One particular response of the pandemic is the launch of our Student Hardship Appeal, established to help vulnerable students during the pandemic. So far, our global alumni community has helped us raise over £750,000 for this appeal. And if you're one of those who has already donated to the appeal, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the university for your kind support at this time of great need. A link to the Student Hardship Appeal will be going out to you after this event, and I encourage you to consider giving if at all possible, as the impact of your donation will have a really significant impact on our students. We are delighted to be joined today by Professor Peter Gries of the Manchester China Institute. He is the Li Kai-hung Chair and Director of the Institute, as well as a Professor of Chinese Politics at the University of Manchester. Some of our alumni in East Asia are already familiar with Professor Gries from events that we've held in the region, and we are delighted to welcome him back to this virtual event this time. Today, Professor Gries will present on the impact that COVID-19 has had on China's relationship with the West. At the end of this presentation, there will be the opportunity to ask questions directly to him as well. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a button that says chat. We would like you to ask any questions that you have for Professor Gries through this chat function. You direct them towards everyone on the options that you have on the chat so that everyone can see the questions. Please feel free to type them at any time during the presentation as well, and we will collate those and then put them together for Professor Gries to answer in the Q&A section after the presentation. Note as well that this event is being recorded, and we'll be able to share the link with you in our follow-up email afterwards. Just before we begin, a few housekeeping requirements as well. If you could ensure that your camera is turned off on your video so that we can improve the connection for everyone watching the presentation. Thank you very much, and remember to stay muted as well if you wouldn't mind. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Gries. He can take it away with his presentation. Thank you.
Hello, are you there? Let's see, I think I need to unmute. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm gonna, let's see, share screen here. Okay, sorry about that. I think we're up and going. Thank you, Simon, and thanks to the entire alumni relations team for organizing this talk. And thank you to everyone in the audience who has turned out to participate in this conversation. I will try to keep my initial comments brief so we have plenty of time for Q&A, as I imagine most people participating have some interesting opinions on this topic. Before we begin, however, I did want to share with those of you who are not familiar with the Manchester China Institute just a little bit of information about us. We were formally launched approximately 2 years ago when we took over what has now been renamed the Li Kai-hung building, right in the heart of the University of Manchester campus. We were very fortunate to have a donation from an honorary alumnus, Li Kai-hung, a Hong Kong businessman who spends a lot of time in Manchester and has worked in Manchester over many decades. And the purpose of the Manchester China Institute is twofold. Broadly, it is to promote China studies and research on China at the University of Manchester. But more narrowly, it does have a normative agenda, which you can see, I think, in this screenshot from our website, which is to promote mutual understanding in UK-China relations. So we do so through our research, but we also do so through a couple of signature programs that we have to promote visibility, and one has to do with diplomatic dialogues. So this is an image from a US-China diplomatic dialogue that I hosted a couple of years ago outside of Shanghai with my colleague Wu Xinbo, who is at Fudan Daxue in Shanghai. And more recently, I have worked at MCI, at Manchester China Institute, to launch something else called the UK-China Diplomatic Dialogue, which is basically builds off of the US-China Diplomatic Dialogue. We had our first gathering of Chinese and British diplomats in Manchester last autumn, and I think it was a very successful opportunity for working level exchange between the diplomats of China and the UK. I'm particularly proud of that event and hope that it will continue in the years to come, serving as a bridge between China and the UK. So that's one of our signature programs, are these diplomatic dialogues between the US and China and the UK and China. Another has a more broad target, which is trying to act as a bridge between the Chinese and British peoples as a whole. And our signature program at this kind of 大众 or mass level or popular level is a photography competition, an international photography competition. And we launched it for the first time last spring on the topic of what does friendship mean to you? And we had an exhibit on campus in Manchester, as well as an awards ceremony last spring, and it went very well. And we're currently in the middle of our second annual photography competition. And this year, the theme is not friendship, but it's family. And I'm delighted to say that we've been getting quite a bit of social media coverage, including this post on Weibo from 中国日报, China Daily. And given the respective coronavirus situations in China and the UK, we've decided to hold our exhibition for our 30 finalists. Right now we have about 170 entries. We hope to double that in the next couple of weeks. The competition will close towards the end of the month. And the 30 finalists will be on display at an art gallery in Chengdu. And then there will be an awards ceremony that should be filmed actually by, I think, Sichuan 电视台, I think at the very end of June. I think that event is June 25th. Anyway, the idea is similar to the diplomatic dialogue, that it seeks to promote mutual understanding. And the idea is that whether it's British submissions or Chinese submissions, by focusing on a common theme, like what does family mean to you, we hope that it can promote empathy, perspective taking, and ultimately mutual understanding, which again is the goal of our institute. So thank you for your patience as I've given you a little bit of background on the Manchester China Institute, which I run. And now I'll get into the meat of what you probably came here for, which is to discuss this question of COVID-19 and how that is shaping China's relations with the West. What I will do is briefly go through some of the recent events that have been tied in with COVID-19 that sort of are indicative of the unfortunate decline in the relationship between China and the West broadly, and the US in particular. US-China relations arguably are probably at their lowest point since Tiananmen, so it's a very difficult time right now. And unfortunately, that's not just a state-to-state matter. It does impact mutual attitudes between the Chinese and Western peoples, including British peoples. So there have been issues of prejudice that have flared up around the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been very, very sad. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the manifestations of competition especially between the US and China, things that are reminiscent of the Cold War, including geopolitics, but I think importantly, extending beyond geopolitics to ideological competition. And that's why I think it really is legitimate to talk about witnessing a new Cold War in the making. So I'm sorry that's a little bit of it's going to be a little bit of a depressing talk, but these are the times that we are living through. Okay, so I'll get started here. Let's see if I can. Yeah, so we've had a big blame game with people on both sides pointing fingers at the other side. Probably, you know, a lot of it really began with accusations on the part of Western leaders, and in particular the Trump administration, pointing to China's culpability, whether accusations about how the virus originated in this market in Wuhan, shown on the left there, which did traffic in wildlife, and it seems highly likely that the virus came, extremely likely, if not certain, that the virus came from wildlife to humans somehow. Of course, there is the other argument that it happened at a virus lab located in Wuhan. Those two arguments are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It could have been a naturally occurring virus that was then leaked when being studied in a lab. Regardless, this kind of origins topic has become a focus of a blame game, which then has led to responses on the Chinese side. Probably many of you have heard of these tweets by Zhao Lijian about how actually the virus originated in the US, and there has been TV coverage in China to the same effect. And also arguments coming out of China that actually point the finger at other parts of the West, like Italy. So taking advantage of a local doctor in Italy who I guess had seen similar flus earlier. I'm not particularly interested in the accuracy of any of these, this finger pointing, but I think it points to this kind of climate of deterioration. And frankly, the infantile sort of tenor of much of the discourse today that is very troubling, a kind of childish, you did it, no, you did it, kind of discourse is not particularly encouraging when it has to do with the two major superpowers of the day. And unfortunately, we've seen this at the very top. You know, Donald Trump was tweeting broadly about a Chinese virus rather than, you know, focusing in on what we could do as mankind, or just even within the US on correcting and coming up with solutions and coping with the pandemic. Instead, this kind of language, especially focusing on Chinese, which suggests Chinese people, I think contributed to prejudice. And Secretary of State, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has also not been particularly diplomatic, given that he is the US's senior diplomat, in his choice of language and in his insistence on focusing in on the issue of a blame game, which should not be, in my view, our focus right now. We should be trying to deal with the situation, not litigating it. Of course, prejudice is not just in the US and the West. There's been a rise of prejudice in China surrounding COVID-19 as well. Some of you may have seen stories about prejudice against Africans who live in China, particularly in the southern city of Guangzhou. I was asked by the university early on to write about this issue of prejudice because we had concerns at the university that some of the incidents of prejudice that we were hearing about occurring vis-a-vis Chinese students living in the West in general, and a few incidents that had occurred in places like Sheffield and London, that we wanted to make sure that our students, our Chinese students at the University of Manchester, did not become collateral damage in these kinds of issues. So I ended up writing a short blog post for the university that built on some of my earlier research in political psychology, and talked a little bit about the dangers of the association between pathogens and prejudice, that there's just such a long history of associating foreigners with disease, that it's one of the real hallmarks of xenophobia, is associating the outside with disease, impurity. And I had actually written about this in my last book, which was a study of American public opinion on foreign affairs. And I had used actually this political cartoon from over a century ago, which was about the 1890 McKinley Tariff and the American debate over protectionism, but had been associated with I think it was a cholera outbreak that had occurred in New York. And so for me, this story captures this kind of association between immigration and xenophobia. This idea that somehow foreigners are dirty and disease-bearing. Of course, that's not, again, unique to the US. We've had these kinds of associations made in China as well. Many of you may be familiar with this ad for a laundry detergent company. Maybe it was a year or so ago, where an African man is put into a laundry machine with the detergent that the company was selling, and he emerges a clean, young, healthy Chinese man. This reminded me very quickly of some of the past discourse in the West. This also is from my last book, and this is from about a century ago, a little over a century ago. The kind of white man's burden that was associated with the duty of the white races to clean the non-white. So this was the sort of high point of American imperialism at the turn of the last century in Cuba, in the Philippines. The idea that Uncle Sam had a responsibility to civilize and purify the darker races. Unfortunately, there have been arguments made that I personally find convincing, that we're seeing echoes of the idea of a white man's burden today in a yellow man's burden, that this idea that Chinese have responsibility to bring civilization and perhaps to purify the darker parts of the world like Africa. And I think that this commercial reflects that a little bit. So we have dangers of prejudice emerging all around. And closer to home here in the UK, some of the very recent discourse coming out of the Boris Johnson administration about how we need to quarantine any foreigners who come to the UK. I think it resonates very much with a nativist base that voted for Brexit. And it's particularly ironic, in my opinion, given that the UK has one of the highest rates of COVID-19 infection. So the idea that somehow, opening up to airline flights is going to be a problem, bringing in disease, I think really is just, again, echoes of this age-old association between foreigners and disease. And there have been similar arguments about China's response, that as things got a little bit better in China about a month ago, China began closing down flights to the rest of the world, only a month or two after complaining that other countries were closing down flights to China. So prejudice does not seem to know national boundaries, unfortunately. Okay, so I'm gonna try to kind of wrap things up. The last section of the talk is gonna move away from the specifics of COVID-19 to a kind of broader discussion of the deterioration of China's relations with the West over the last few years, and in particular with the US. And I would definitely say that there has been a bipartisan consensus in the United States over the last couple of years that engagement with China has not worked as well as many had hoped. And so you have an unusual situation where politicians on the left and right, both Democrats and Republicans, who disagree on just about everything, can agree on China. Now, they often do so for very different reasons, and we could talk about that in the Q&A. But there is a consensus among Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, that China policy has not worked, that China is becoming more authoritarian and not more open, and that this is not in the interests of the Chinese people or the people of the world. So that seems to have been a evolving and growing consensus, certainly in the US, and I think in the West among China watchers more broadly over the last several years. Of course, things have exploded recently. On the Chinese side, Hu Xijin of the Global Times has been actively talking about the need for building up China's nuclear forces. And of course, this echoes of the Cold War between the US and especially the Soviet Union in the 20th century, where a nuclear arms race was at the heart of the Cold War. And certainly was not helpful and led to proxy wars around the rest of the world as a result of this kind of nuclear face-off, essentially. So that's Hu Xijin. Of course, we're seeing tensions rise all around the world between China and the West, many flashpoints from Korea to the South China Sea. I'll just talk briefly about Taiwan. Working with a colleague of mine, I've written a little bit about the evolution of Chinese discourse on the Taiwan issue. And this piece that was published online in Foreign Affairs a little over a year ago was looking at how developments in Washington, Beijing, and Taipei were all not looking well for the prospects of peaceful reunification. And we did focus quite a bit on changing discourse in mainland China, where the traditional focus on 和平统一, peaceful reunification, began to shift a few years ago, with more and more Chinese losing patience over the likelihood of peaceful reunification working. With the election of the new DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, in Taiwan, a war of words escalated between Tsai and Xi. And I think more and more Chinese got frustrated that 和平统一 was not working and began to advocate a new line, which is 武力统一, or forceful reunification. And unfortunately, as this was happening in China, there were many developments in the US and Taiwan that were also destabilizing the Taiwan Straits. Unfortunately, I would argue that in the year plus since we wrote this piece and it was published over a year ago, the trends seem to be similar. In fact, I think recent developments suggest that things are getting even worse. The aircraft carrier actually is several years ago that a PLA aircraft carrier circumnavigated Taiwan. That was one of the first early indications that this discourse of 武力统一 was not just words, that it was being backed with more active plans to potentially utilize military means to resolve the issue. So I remain very concerned about cross-strait relations. I think what I want to do is end on the point I made, I think, at the end of the introduction, which is that what we're seeing now between China and the US and China and the West more broadly is more than just geopolitical competition. We haven't talked too much about economic and trade disputes. Obviously, there's the US-China trade war. You know, there's plenty we could talk about there in the material realm. So there's plenty of competition in the traditional realm of geopolitics, realpolitik, competition over terms of trade, investment, competition over security. But to me, what is perhaps more worrisome is that increasingly we're seeing open competition that is ideological. The US under the Trump administration seems to be stepping up its push to encourage the Chinese people to adopt more progressive form of multi-party governance. I don't know if many of you saw, but the Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, actually gave a talk on May 4th at the University of Virginia in Chinese, and his Chinese is quite good. He has a little bit of a zhuanshar in his Korean. I'm not sure if it's exactly a Beijing Korean, but his Chinese is not bad. But the content of the message was essentially to bypass the Chinese government, speak directly to the Chinese people, and appeal to the May 4th legacy. You might argue that it was a kind of softer approach to dealing with China on the part of the Trump administration. Unfortunately, though, that's not how many Chinese elites responded to it. The Global Times was furious, arguing that basically that the Trump administration was trying to divide and conquer China, and that Pottinger did not understand that the fundamental message of May 4th was not enlightenment and liberalism, but actually nationalism. We could have a discussion of that during Q&A. But more broadly, what I want to point out is that we are seeing this kind of emerging ideological competition between a Washington consensus and a Beijing consensus. So increasingly, in addition to the US side promoting liberalism in China and around the world, what's fairly new now is you see a China that is actively exporting authoritarianism. And this idea of authoritarian capitalism as a new type of political party system, as Xi Jinping discussed during the Lianghui in 2018, so 2 years ago. And you've seen a use of the kind of mask diplomacy for the Xi Jinping administration to try to trumpet the efficacy of authoritarian capitalism in dealing with things like COVID-19. And it's particularly striking the way that this has been coupled with a kind of very aggressive attack on liberal democracies as incompetent, impotent, unable to deal with the COVID-19 situation, unable to protect their own people. Many of you may have seen this video that was released recently, mocking the Trump administration's response to COVID-19, even using animation, which is quite entertaining. But more broadly, we have, I think, what's been widely described as the emergence of a new kind of diplomacy in China. It's no longer Deng Xiaoping's motto of Tao Guang Yang Hui. Instead, it seems to be more a focus on this idea of a wolf warrior diplomacy, one where diplomats need to be tough and stand up for China rather than conciliatory. And it certainly seems that the political incentives for diplomats stationed abroad, whether in Paris or elsewhere, is to talk tough. And I think that does seem to be a way to advance your career back in Beijing. Unfortunately, it is creating an impression that China is not peaceful. And I think that is contributing to an increasingly widespread distrust of China among Western publics. So that brings me to my last slide, and I didn't want to end on such a pessimistic note, so I wanted to quote myself. This was from an interview I did a couple of years ago for the Shanghai Institute of American Studies, which did this really remarkable set of interviews of Chinese and Americans who have been involved in Sino-American relations. They did it to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the formal reestablishment of US-China relations in 1979. So these videos were released last year in 2019 on the 40th anniversary. And I felt very honored to be, I believe, the youngest of the Americans that was asked to participate. I think the most senior among them was Henry Kissinger, was also interviewed for this. But in my interview, I spoke primarily about the need for mutual understanding, in a way going back to the mission of the Manchester China Institute, that we need to learn to step back and learn how to listen to one another. We need to step into the shoes of the other and try to see issues from the other's perspective. That does not require agreeing with what you learn or condoning behaviors you don't agree with. But it is the first step, I think, towards promoting mutual understanding and de-escalating the situation. And so I guess I'll end with the plea that everyone participating in today's Zoom think about things that we can each do individually to act as a bridge between China and the West, or China and the UK, and help our compatriots. My main job is to help British students and the Western public understand the Chinese perspective. Those of you who are in China, I hope that you take full advantage of the time you have spent in the UK and try to help your family members, your friends, understand where Brits are coming from when they think about international affairs. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything, but we can all try to act as individual diplomats or ambassadors, or to use the metaphor of a bridge between our different societies. And I am an optimist at heart, and I do believe that if enough of us work hard to promote mutual understanding, we can reverse these current trends and restore China's relations to the West to the healthy relationship that they deserve and that they should be. So I'll leave it there, and I welcome questions.
Pete, are you
Yes.
able to see the chat bar at the moment, or would you like me to read you the questions?
Why don't you read them? I'm not seeing the chat bar at the moment.
Okay.
Or just choose a few.
Sure. Well, we'll go through them in order of submission.
Okay.
That's fair. So the first one is from Lim Chi Yang. There is a theory that there are many within the CCP echelon who are unhappy with Xi. Leaks to media suggest it is, or suggest this is the case, I think. Is Xi's position stable, is the question.
Yeah, I think I would have to bounce that back at the questioner. This used to be called the realm of Pekingology, sort of trying to read the tea leaves of elite politics in Beijing. And based here in the UK, I think it's particularly difficult to do so. And I think that people based in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and certainly within China and Taiwan have access to as much or more information than I do on this. And it's not my area of focus. I'm primarily a political psychologist, interested bottom up at public opinion and how ideologies and identities shape mutual attitudes. So I don't really spend a lot of time focusing on elite politics and factionalism. So I don't feel well qualified to answer that question. Clearly, there have been reports that there are a lot of elite Chinese who aren't happy with this dramatic deterioration of China's relations with the West and would like to see a more conciliatory approach. And you can certainly imagine that a lot of people blame Xi Jinping for certainly the poor initial handling of the crisis, and even also for how the COVID-19 situation has been allowed to contribute to a broader and ongoing deterioration of China's relations with the West. So I think there probably is plenty of grievance, not just at the popular level, but also at the elite level within China. To what extent that represents a serious threat to Xi Jinping's rule, I doubt it. I think it's pretty clear that Xi has been very adept at reversing 3 to 4 decades of movement, starting with Deng, towards more collective leadership. You know, from Deng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, you know, we had increasing decentralization of power, but with Xi Jinping's ascendance, it's been a complete reversal. And everything I see suggests that he has consolidated his power. And China today is much more authoritarian than it was before he came to power. So yeah, I think it might be wishful thinking among those who want to see progressive change in China to like to think that you know, Xi Jinping's authoritarian grip on power is weakening, but I guess I'm doubtful.
Okay, our next question comes from Alex Chan of the Singapore Alumni Association. His first question is, when are you coming to Singapore again? And the second question is, at this point in time with COVID-19, who will come out as the winner or loser in general, China, the US, or the EU?
Great question. Thank you, Alex, for the invitation. I think you know that I was actually born in Singapore at what was then Raffles Hospital, I believe. And I do love visiting Singapore, so I hope that won't be too far in the future. Who are the winners and losers? I don't think there are any winners. I think everyone is a loser. And I think probably in particular, the US and China are the big losers. The Trump administration has proved itself completely incompetent. And I think because in part of the wolf warrior diplomacy and these kind of very all thumbs kinds of attempts to control the production of knowledge about China and COVID-19, I think it's kind of backfired among international audiences. So it's not just that COVID-19 originated in China, it's how China has sort of is perceived outside of China as trying to bully other countries on the issue and trying to force a particular version of events, and even been condescending in its depiction of its mask diplomacy. I think China ends up being a big loser as well. The EU, maybe slightly less of a loser. I mean, you have more variation between European countries in terms of how well they've dealt with COVID-19. They've largely stayed out of this, if you'll excuse the phrase, pissing match of the blame game between the Trump and Xi administrations, which I think actually makes the Europeans look better. But clearly, you know, the economic impact on Europe is going to be substantial. And so you're going to see a recession for several years. Everyone is going to suffer. There are no winners out of this, and it's going to take a long time, not just to restore healthy economies around the world, but to build up any kind of sense of mutual trust and to combat the kinds of prejudice that has been allowed to flourish in this context of the ability of people on the far right and nativists to return to these tropes of foreigners and disease that have been prevalent for so long. So yeah, no winners, unfortunately. I hate to be a pessimist, but sorry, Alex.
Okay. Peter, just to say, we've got quite a healthy number of questions come through, so we'll try and go through them I
Feel
don't
free,
wish to go.
Simon, if you want to aggregate a few, like if you see patterns, or
Okay,
give me a
sure.
few at a time, and then I can do it a
Yeah.
little bit.
Well, the next is from Benson. He asks, disengagement seems to be on the way. If so, how long will this process take to partially or completely complete? I suppose it depends if you think that disengagement is happening, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think this may be where the Cold War analogy, a new Cold War, is the most misleading, because the 21st century, moving in now 2020, sort of entering the middle of the 21st century, is very different from the middle of the 19th century in terms of our global interconnectedness. Across all dimensions, our interdependence is just orders of magnitude higher than it was in the mid-19th century. And just looking at economics, which is usually the focus of these discussions of decoupling, the interdependence is just so tremendous that it's really hard to imagine the kind of decoupled world that we inhabited in the 50s and 60s and 70s through the 80s, where you really had two blocks that could reasonably be called independent blocks. I just don't see that happening. The global economy is just too interconnected. Things that happen in one place impact things that happen in another place. Now, we may see, steps in that direction as countries try to reduce their dependence on international connections. If not for reasons of prejudice, for concerns about susceptibility to risk. But the reality is it's going to be extremely difficult. I think what we all need psychologically is to accept the fact that we live in an increasingly small, globalized, interconnected world. And we need to learn how to live with the differences that divide us, but continue to engage one another. We can work together and we can engage even while we don't completely trust one another, and we need to slowly rebuild trust. But while we do so, we need to continue to work together. We need to recognize that so many of the problems that we face individually in our lives and that are aggregated to our national levels are really global problems. I mean, global warming, for example, global financial crises, global health pandemics, they just cannot be completely solved by individuals or even individual nations. They require global responses. And we just need to help our compatriots around the world understand that it's just a fantasy to think that we can somehow survive as islands in an ocean, that things that happen in other countries will not affect us. I mean, if anything, COVID-19 should demonstrate that something that happens in Wuhan is going to affect all of us. And whether we like it or not, we need to accept that and deal with it. And unfortunately, the aftermath of these last few months, our failure to work together has proven we have a long way to go in learning how to do that.
Okay. The next question, Peter, comes from all the way from Auckland, from Sambeth. Specifically, he asks, forgive me, he or she asks, would COVID-19 be a pushing factor towards a change in the existing international system? And specifically, perhaps you could comment on how it might affect the geopolitical power order in Southeast Asia. What might be the biggest impacts on small states in the aftermath?
Yeah, this is a great question. Maybe I'll deal with it in two parts. First, at the global level, clearly, I think most scholars of international relations agreed that when the Cold War ended, in the late 80s, early 90s, you did have a brief unipolar moment where America truly was the sole superpower and its power was largely unquestioned. You know, since the turn of this past century, China's rise has engendered more and more attention. And so, you know, the idea is, do we have bipolarity? Is it going to be a balance of power between the US and China, with Europe somehow fitting in there, and, you know, big competition over Eastern Europe? And we could talk about some of these strategic issues. I think, though, what you may see as a result of COVID-19 is that more and more people around the world seeing cracks in both US and Chinese power, that the perception of US unrivaled power and the perception of China as an unstoppable rising force, both of those may change significantly along with their actual power. So both of the economies are going to be slowing down, just like the entire world. But what you're going to see is a movement towards, I think, a greater distribution of power. So I do think at the global level, you are seeing an acceleration of trends away from American-dominated unipolarity, but even potentially away from the idea of bipolarity between the US and China. And I think you might argue something similar in Southeast Asia. You know, as you have such visible differences between how different countries have managed COVID-19, with some countries like New Zealand and Australia actually doing remarkably well, others having greater challenges. Perceptions of national capabilities are changing. And in my view, as a political psychologist, it's those perceptions that matter. From a psychological perspective, perception is reality. So when people around Southeast Asia see countries, for example, like Taiwan and New Zealand and Australia, that may be seen as small players, certainly in terms of population, vis-a-vis large population countries like China and Indonesia, I think that alters the way that they think about these countries and the roles that they can play in the regional system. So I wouldn't be surprised if you do see some changing thinking about the relative contribution of different powers in the Southeast Asian system. But I'm not really an expert on that. And as I mentioned to Alex, I look forward to visiting Singapore again and better understanding Southeast Asian relations with China, and particularly the South China Sea issue is high on my agenda, because I've done quite a bit of work on US-China, US-Japan, even Japan-Korea, and Japan-Taiwan. But South China Seas and Southeast Asia is another hotspot, and one that I look forward to learning more about. Thank you.
We've had a number of questions pertaining to whether the relationship between the US and China will shift should the Trump administration end with the next elections in the US, or indeed whether China bashing, conversely, will become a hot topic during the presidential debates. So your take on that, really, whether a Democratic administration would be more pro-China, or the relationship would.
This is a great question, and I actually, as an American, even though I'm a professor in the UK, I do feel pretty well situated to talk about this, especially given that my last book was actually about partisanship and ideology in US public opinion, and how it shapes American attitudes towards foreign countries, including China. So those of you in search of a sleeping aid, I would recommend my last book with Stanford, The Politics of American Foreign Policy. I think my answer to that would be in two steps. The first is, yes, I think China will again be an issue during the presidential campaign. Trump will try to appeal to his supporters on the far right of the Republican Party, who have more anti-China ideological predispositions. So for example, I think a lot of Trump supporters are, don't tread on me kinds of libertarians. People who are all about, this is my right to carry a gun, I'll do what I want. This libertarian tradition in the American ideological landscape is one that is fundamentally fearful of concentrated state power. American libertarians on the American far right do not trust the US government. They don't even trust the Trump administration, honestly. That's why they keep guns. They certainly wouldn't trust a Democratic administration. And if Biden wins, you're going to see gun sales go up because the libertarian supporters of Donald Trump will be more fearful of concentrated power, federal power in Washington. But you can imagine that makes them only the more fearful of any kind of authoritarian government, certainly a communist government, which is perceived fearfully as a threat to individual liberty. So I think Trump, has reasons to play to his base by bashing China. Now, that said, Joe Biden and the Democrats, for different reasons, have become much more wary of China. And generally speaking, on the left, concerns about China have more to do with issues like Xinjiang and human rights. And the Xi Jinping administration have given American liberals like myself a lot to be unhappy about. The treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang is shocking. It's truly shocking. And the deterioration of the human rights of the Chinese people under the Xi Jinping administration is also extremely worrisome. So for those of us in the US who have Chinese friends, who care about the Chinese people, we also worry about developments in China. So I think, both sides, again, I was talking about an emerging consensus in the US on the left and right that China policy isn't working. That said, it's undergirded by different ideological predispositions and attitudes. That said, when Biden wins, and I will insist on that because I need to be an optimist and I need to have hope, I think a Joe Biden Democratic administration, while being concerned about the deterioration of liberties in China, concerned about issues like the plight of Muslims in China, the loss of human rights in China, I think they will be much more pragmatic and much more even-footed on China policy. One of the huge dangers of the current Trump administration has been its volatility in all of its foreign policies, and certainly on China. The topic that I spoke about before that I've done some research on recently, cross-strait relations. Now, a big part of the increasing danger in the Taiwan Straits is the changing discourse in China, the new conversation about Wu Li Tongyi, about forceful reunification. But the Trump administration has also contributed to destabilizing the Taiwan Straits because he goes back and forth depending on who flatters his ego. The man is a narcissist. And, if you can pad his self-love, he'll say whatever he wants. So he'll say something very pro-Taiwan 1 minute and then something very pro-Beijing the next minute. And that is extremely destabilizing and very, very dangerous. And I really do believe that a Biden administration would return US foreign policy to a much more even keel. Diplomats would be allowed to do their job again and would not be usurped by the White House and a group of people who don't really respect even the idea of diplomacy and are much more inclined towards basically bullying and uses of force. So I do see both sides potentially having rhetoric during the campaign that might end up being against the communist administration in China now. I wouldn't say it's necessarily anti-Chinese. A lot of the discourse, again, will be about the Chinese government and not about the Chinese people. But I think there would be a huge difference if there's a democratic administration. I think everyone who lives on this planet, if all they care about is war or peace for the 21st century, they should be rooting for Joe Biden, because you will see a much more even-keeled foreign policy, where a second Trump administration could end up being even more reckless, and we could stumble into a war that nobody wants.
Pete, have we got time for one more question?
I can do it. I don't know if you need to stop exactly.
We'll have one more question. I've tried to combine a number of questions that people had, and I'd just like to thank everyone for posting so many questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but there's been a number of comments to the effect of how can China repair the soft power that it was building pre-pandemic, relating as well to Belt and Road and how that might be resumed, and also in general, how can China thrive post-pandemic?
Great questions. I would say the most basic thing would be to back off from the wolf warrior style diplomacy. I think in many ways, the Chinese Communist Party has in a way become a hostage or a victim of the success of its own nationalistic propaganda, that it has utilized this kind of 反帝爱国主义, this anti-Western imperialism kind of socialization to its advantage to help shore up and legitimate its rule. And it's done so very successfully, utilizing the educational system, utilizing entertainment like movies, television series, anti-Japanese, 抗日战争, 电视连续剧, these serial TV dramas about World War II. They have all, I think, quite successfully instilled this kind of anti-imperialist kind of sentiment in China. But unfortunately, what that has done is that has created a group of Chinese who are very nationalistic, and particularly very anti-Japan, and to a lesser extent, anti-US and Europe. And the problem is, when those people rise up and demand action, demand tougher policies, it's hard for Beijing to say no, because Beijing bases its claim to legitimate rule in large part based on a nationalist claim to legitimate rule that began with Mao Zedong in 1949. 中国人民站起来了, the Chinese people have stood up. The Chinese Communist Party made a nationalist claim to legitimate rule from its very founding. Now, it also made communist claims to rule, but unfortunately, with the famine that followed the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, communism was largely discredited. So today, the Chinese Communist Party relies in large measure on its nationalist claims to rule, and that puts it between a rock and a hard place when popular nationalists demand tougher policies. And that includes things like encouraging its diplomats to play tough. So I guess what I would hope the Chinese government could do is start to celebrate the cosmopolitan traditions in Chinese history, rather than focus myopically on the Bainian Guochi, which is certainly something that happened. You can't deny there was an Opium War. And it's important, for example, that Brits better understand the Opium War. That's something that we at the University of Manchester are working hard on, help British understand the Chinese perspective on issues like this. But Chinese should also celebrate more cosmopolitan traditions, such as Tang Dynasty cosmopolitanism. And along with that, return to a more even-handed I think, wiser diplomacy of Deng Xiaoping, which is one that says we need to engage the world rather than necessarily have this incredibly tough-minded kind of wolf warrior kind of attitude. So I think my suggestion to Beijing would be to think about a different kind of more cosmopolitan socialization of the Chinese people, help them get a broader understanding of how China has interacted with the world over the last several millennia, and perhaps reduce the incentives for political elites and diplomats to have this tough image, because it really is backfiring on China. Western sentiment towards China is deteriorating. And I think the easiest thing China can do to restore positive views of China is just ease up on the wolf warrior kinds of discourse and behavior. And then, potentially work on some of the more positive things, such as cooperative efforts, being a team player in international society, which I think China has proven to be able to do in the past, and I think will be able to do in the future as well.
Okay, Pete, thank you very much for answering all of those questions, and for the fantastic presentation as well. We really appreciate that. And I'd like to also thank our guests for putting forward so many questions, and it's been really considered and thoughtful questions there that really good to have that forum. Just to wrap up, as we mentioned earlier, Manchester has a global network of alumni, and I would encourage all of you, if you're not already in touch with your local alumni network, do look up for joining opportunities there. We have alumni associations across the region, throughout China, in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia. So I do encourage you to look those up. You can search for the University of Manchester Global Network and you'll find links in your area. I'd also like to just bring to your attention that the University of Manchester, as one of its core strategic goals, has a social responsibility, and we rank highly in the Times Higher Education's societal impact ranking in the UK and globally for our work there. The Manchester Day of Action is an event that's fast approaching, and there'll be more details coming your way in the follow-up email from this event. So do look out for that as well, and opportunities to get involved with how you can have an impact as an alumnus of the university as well. We'll also be sending some details of the appeal that I mentioned earlier. So again, I encourage you to partake in that if you can. We sincerely appreciate your contribution to the university. So once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. If you're in Asia, or at lunchtime if you're back in Europe. Thank you very much for listening to Peter. And again, Peter, thank you very much for your thought-provoking, fascinating presentation today. I've really enjoyed it myself. So yeah.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks to all of you for joining us. And my apologies that we weren't able to get through to everyone's questions. But I really enjoyed it, and I hope we can all work together to improve the situation. I think those of us who have bicultural experiences, so those of us who have lived outside of our own countries, the way I think all of us have, we have an extra responsibility to help our family and friends better understand the perspectives of the other side. And again, it's not to convince people of anything, but it's to start a conversation towards understanding and restoring mutual trust and understanding. So anyway, thank you.